Hey everybody, welcome back to Human Reaction, your weekly source for independent commentary on news, politics, and culture, where it is always our mission to arm you with the tools that you need to cut through media misdirection and resist the mono-narrative. Today, we basically have one mission, and that is to look into the tragedy that has occurred in the latest conflict in Israel. It's a very fraught topic, and we're going to do our absolute best to navigate it carefully, respectfully, with every bit of caution and care that we possibly can. And David has done a tremendous amount of research, and we're going to, I think, try to look at this through a lens that helps. That's going to help our listeners and viewers with some mental models in how to perceive this issue. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, and trying to forge a different path, because so many of the existing dialogue about this are very worn grooves in the American mindset, that, and it's kind of like trying to get out of those grooves and into new territory to think about this without committing the kind of errors that are so common in this space. My story on this is, for years I avoided the Israel-Palestine conflict, right? Even in college, I remember reading about it and just thinking, I just don't want to think about this. It's such a difficult and indetractable problem. And for a lot of this week, I stayed up super late at night. I barely saw my family. I was a terrible dad and husband because I was so grappling with this issue and like how to try to create something here that was responsible, right? Because one of the things I saw on Saturday is there's so much irresponsibility immediately. I mean, the benefit of being a weekly news show is we can hopefully give some detachment and kind of de-emotionalize and step back, and while hopefully maintaining a certain degree of moral clarity, right?
And allowing facts to sort of come to full fruition and full light, right? We're not as prone to maybe the very reactionary emotional thing that can happen when something is so fresh, right? We have a little bit of space, and so hopefully we can provide that for our viewers today as well.
That's right, yeah. And so for our disclaimer here, nothing can justify the murder of innocent civilians. Nothing can. I mean, we're talking about children and babies and terrible, terrible things that are happening to these people. There are a lot of people on the internet with room temperature IQ who are taking advantage of the emotion of the moment to say that anyone who wants to understand this issue and a 75-year-long conflict is justifying the atrocity that happened on, last Saturday. And let me be absolutely clear. On October 7th, 2023, the actions of Hamas were absolutely pure evil. And there's no justification in the world for doing what they did, period. And we start there, but then if that's all you need to know, you're also making yourself liable to problems, right? You could make things worse if you only know that, right? Fear is the mind killer at the end of the day. It's the thing that when we're emotional about something, we make bigger errors. So we have to use our reason. We have to think our way through this problem and reason our way through this problem and use our cool heads to sort this out. Righteous indignation might make you look good on social media, but it will not save innocent lives. If that's your goal, if your stated goal is to preserve life, righteous indignation won't do that. And then another point is that a tremendous amount of the existing kind of like mental grooves that the American public is in this, and maybe the West, I don't know, is euphemisms and cliches based upon stereotypes. Trying to get out of those ruts of how we think of Israel, how we think of Palestine, to build a moral framework that rejects collectivism and charts a pathway to peace is kind of the goal set that I set for myself this week as I was trying to articulate not just what happened, because that's part of our responsibility, but also the kind of mental models that people might consider to interpret the news as it rolls out over the next week and months, perhaps, with this conflict.
Absolutely. And I think a very important disclaimer, and we have to make people very clear where we stand because it's a very, very sensitive topic and a sensitive time. For those folks that might not be clear about the area, can we kind of lay the groundwork and establish some facts here in terms of what the situation looks like in Israel and Palestine.
Yep. Yeah. So we can jump over to the map here. What we have is this area on the west by the sea called Gaza, right? This is a very different area than the other Palestinian areas, such as the West Bank. What we want to make the point is since 2007, Gaza has existed as its own kind of zone area that is quarantined off from the rest of Israel through a series of fortifications, walls, checkpoints. In order for someone in Gaza to get access to jobs outside of Gaza, they have to get a work permit and go through a checkpoint on a daily basis. That kind of gives you a picture of what Gaza is like. It's been run by an organization called Hamas for some time, since I believe the elections were 2007. There hasn't been an election since then that I'm aware of. And the charter of Hamas has changed substantially over time. And one of the areas of manipulation here is like, what is Hamas? Like, what is this group? As people kind of like select, intentionally select different time periods to make what Hamas is. But more about the area, and we'll get back to that later. About 2.5 million people live there. It's about 5 miles wide by about 25 miles long, about twice the size of Washington, D.C., right? Not a very big area if you're thinking about it in Montana terms especially, but even in like West Coast terms, in a tremendous amount of people very densely packed into that area. Half of these people are children, about 50%. That's because the family size of this is very, very large.
So you're talking about 1.25 million people under the age of 18 in the population of Gaza.
That is according to the statistics I was looking at. Yeah.
Okay.
80% of the people who eat there don't eat there because they grow food there or because they make money and then buy food that's imported. Very difficult to get anything out of the Gaza Strip. Most of it, and some of the statistics I was looking at, 80% of the people who live there survive on foreign aid only.
Foreign aid, like foreign governments supporting them.
Right.
Okay.
The other 20% are people who work outside of Gaza, who live in Gaza, and then, buy from grocery stores and things like that.
And does foreign aid include like humanitarian organizations, nonprofits?
Right.
Okay.
So
really, sorry, just to clarify, like there's no like real economy that exists there.
Yeah, there is and there isn't. So that you'll have like a shopping mall there or like a water park, right? 2.5 million people live there and they have cell phones, right? It's a very strange, hard to wrap your head around sort of situation because it's both like a modern city, but also not. And there's also large areas of it that are rubble and have been rubble since the second Intifada in the early 2000s. And there's a tremendous amount of stagnation there, right? Because it's pretty much been locked into this place. And I'm trying to avoid using all the words that are used everywhere else in order to keep us out of the American mind groove, right? Because I don't want to send the signal that I'm on a side at any given point. What I'm trying to do is empower people with knowledge so that they can make up their minds. And that's incredibly hard to do in this space.
To understand the American mind groove, what would that language be? How would that be referred to?
Open air prison.
Gaza is referred to as an open air prison.
Yeah. That's usually by pro-Palestinian organization. Israel say like, and it's an indetractable, difficult question because Gaza has been a Palestinian area for a very long time, since like the original 1940s. But it's shrunk a little bit, but it's like the most contiguous Palestinian area in Israel. If you look at the map, the West Bank is an example. Like if you look at the white line, that's the original like agreement on the West Bank. And then if you look at all these colors, and this is very difficult for me to do because I'm colorblind, so help me here, Joe.
I got you.
You had the Palestinian Authority and what they control versus what is settler owned versus what is open, like not like inhabited by anybody.
Yeah. So we're seeing the various areas that are shaded blue looks like the Fatah faction.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a lot of it that is not colored or shaded in any way. That's all the uninhabited areas? Right?
Uninhabited, and then there's the difficulty of where there are settlements being built by Israel in the West Bank, and that's been a debate that you've probably heard of before. Like it boils up occasionally in the last 20 years, where Israel is building not the government but private actors one of the disclaimers I had, maybe I should have had, is that for both sides, there are official actors, right? There's the official Israeli government's actions, and then there's actions of private individuals. Some of those private individuals do horrible things that the Israeli government doesn't want them to do, right? And there's not a monopoly on power there where everything that private actors do, the government likes. And then there's also the same thing with the Palestinians, where there are things that individual Palestinians do that Hamas doesn't want, and vice versa. Does it make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Or the PLO, or at different eras, or the Palestinian Authority, or whatever. Each one of these groups and factions have both official actions and unofficial actions. So it gets really murky once you get into there, because like you'll have these maps that show the shrinking of Palestine over time. And Israel has a criticism of that map that says like, well, look, I mean, these are all different things that explain a very complex history, and we don't want to simplify it to make it look like Israel's just taking land. Mm-hmm. In some circumstances, they kind of just took land, right? I mean, like they say it's like a just spoil of war, but that is what they're taking.
Sure.
And kind of renegotiating the deal using a conflict, and that's part of international situations like this. Trying once again not to use the loaded language, but noting that the shrinking that's happening there, some of that's happening because of private citizens buying land justly, and other ones of people who are perhaps taking that land as private citizens, right? We have all these, they have, very specific circumstances where there is Palestinians have raised this case of, hey, we had this area that my family's been in, the West Bank, for a very long time, and now someone's moved in there and I can't get into it. And there's a general, that's like the crux of the entire 75-year history here, is a disagreement over this land and who has the just claim to it at the end of the day. And what is the right methods to accomplish what each actor wants to accomplish. One more thing about Gaza, unless you got question about that.
No.
Okay.
I was just going to say, I would like to, and I don't want to oversimplify, because I know that the history is very long and very complex, but perhaps an overview of some of the historical conflicts that have occurred would be appropriate. And I don't know if we have maybe necessarily the time to even go into that, but perhaps we could link some resources in the show notes that would allow people somewhere to go to really dig into that, because it's well documented and it's very long standing. I
think we'll touch on it as we go through the mental models too, because a lot of this has to do with, as I'm educating myself, finding errors, right? I mean, I would watch one guy explain the history, and he was pro-Israel, and he omits some really key information that looks really bad for Israel. And then someone else talk about that from the Palestinian point of view, and then kind of cast Israel as if it was only official actions and things that sometimes weren't in the government's control, right? And then kind of casting that all as one giant thing. Mm. And it gets very complicated there, right? Anytime you're making a media product, you got to cut fat. You got to try to slim it down so people can understand it. And complexity can be a problem. The great thing about long form interview formats is hopefully then we can dig into all the rabbit holes and then hopefully pull ourselves out back again and try to make sure the overall point stays on track. Mm-hmm. But a couple more statistics here on Gaza. Youth unemployment is 70%. Adult unemployment is 50%. There's all kinds of arbitrary lack of, a difficult lack of ability to get a job and have a normal economy, in part because of what Israel owns in this is their policies around this, such as if you wanted to get a job outside of Gaza, and your brother has a connection to Hamas, you might not get that job. In fact, it might be the policy that it's impossible for you to get the job, right?
Just because of my association with someone who is in Hamas.
Right. At least that is the reporting from them. Sure. Right. I could find nothing that said that wasn't true. Right. And then additionally to that, it's a security dilemma for Israel, right? They don't want to let people out of Gaza. The whole point of having everyone in Gaza was in order to limit the liability of the areas outside of Gaza from a terrorist attack, right?
Sure.
Access to clean water is a huge issue there. And power is a huge issue there. About 3 hours of power a day was the standard before this whole fight and what's happened in the last few days. 3 hours a day. So if you're born at 8 a.m, and you need an incubator, That means they have a generator that's running, hopefully long enough, when they have access to fuel, hopefully long enough, and they have the money to buy fuel, hopefully long enough to get you to the period in the day where there's actually power to run your incubator, and then they got to put you back on a generator. That's the kind of level of wealth we're talking about out of this area. Very, very poor in that sense. And why there's a brownout every day and only power for 3 hours a day, I don't know. I couldn't find any clear answer about that. Why access to clean water is such a huge problem, I'm not really sure. There's some of it is like the Palestinians are blaming the Israelis for that. There's also the infrastructure problem that's just inherent in being an area that's bombed regularly. And then there's also Hamas. Like, video today came out that showed Hamas like digging up pipes underground and then turning them into mortar shells. And so then you're like, well, it's hard to completely blame Israel for that, right? I don't know what the variables are that would be able to do that, but it's definitely not as clean of a narrative as this is just Israel being jerks, right? Yeah. On the other side of it, the Gaza Strip is kind of Israel's responsibility if it's not a nation state, right? And if it's not if the official policy is that they aren't citizens of Israel, but they're kind of Israel's responsibility in a sense. That's the kind of the vagaries that exist here. That's like, if you ask someone, are they Israel's responsibility? I think a Palestinian would say no, but Israel's doing all these things to them, right? So,
yeah, I mean, I guess my question would be like, if Israel is sort of arbitrating who can leave the country, if you can get a job, if you know certain people, it does burden them with a bit of responsibility to care for those people if they're limiting their freedom and ability to go and live normal, free lives.
Right. And there's also the obvious security dilemma of that for Israel, right? That they're trying to navigate through. And the fact that it's indetractable and bears risk is just the nature of it, right? You can't escape that. So the question is how to reach the ends that they want using means that are compatible with their values.
To clarify one thing, intractable, right?
Yeah.
Intractable, not able to be solved or moved, I think is generally the definition. For people that are hearing you say that, you've used it a few times, I just want to make sure we're clear on the definition of that. I can look it up, in fact.
What I'm meaning is an insolvable problem, right?
Correct.
Like, you can't have the perfect intelligence to know if your brother being part of Hamas is a sufficient cause for you not to get a work permit, right? And if the way you think of, here's the criticism of Israel in this space, potentially, and this would be true for some Israelis, but not all. And I want to make the difference there, is that there is a mental model amongst Israelites and people from Israel, that that all Palestinians are X, or that all Palestinians don't count in some way, that they're not the same kind of person the rest of us are. And that they're in that faction that believes that, that mental model is there, and it's a real part of what they have to contend with. A radical faction that's like, hey, you guys should never been here, or we need to get rid of you, or we gotta, that doesn't make a difference between Hamas and Palestinians, between innocents and non-innocents, right?
And is that because you referred to the term up front as collectivism? Is that a symptom? Is that a collectivist viewpoint?
Yeah, right. If you remove individual action and you just associate the things that you want to associate with the collective, another way to think about it is groups don't act, individuals do. Groups don't steal, individuals steal. They can't commit murder, individuals commit murder. When Germany invades Russia, right? That's a particular chancellor of Germany deciding to do that in the Prussian War, right? They send individuals to go do that. Now, it's a shorthand to say Germany invades Russia, and sometimes that's convenient, that's helpful. But you don't want to confuse the moral matrix of your methodology, right? Meaning like how you conceptualize the moral standing of everybody involved. If it's not individualism, if it's not using individual statistics, you're doing something that could be rife with error, right? I mean, it's on every level of analysis, right? Hamas is not Palestine, right? They're a government that was elected in 2007 that right now 50% of the people there weren't born yet.
to elect them.
Yeah. Right. And then
just to make another point, they came to power in 2007 and haven't left power. So ostensibly they've just retained power. There may not be the means for a democratic election that we would be accustomed to in the West.
But polling does suggest that they're very popular there. Right? So like, what do you believe? Like it's difficult to tease that out. And so how do you associate everything when Hamas does with the people? And then additionally to that, if you say, okay, we want to make sure we don't commit the Osama bin Laden error, which was his argument was, you elected Bill Clinton, therefore it's okay for me to attack you at 9/11 because Bill Clinton killed 500,000 children in Iraq in the 1990s. You have a democratic accountability because democracy exists and you're a voter in that democracy. You're responsible for your leaders, and therefore it's okay if I kill you, is what bin Laden said. We don't want to make his error, right? And we definitely want to make sure that well-meaning people who are trying to navigate this with good faith don't make the mistake of the collectivist mistake. So let's dive into what happened this weekend, because just to catch anyone up if you've been living under a rock since then. 1,500 fighters out of nowhere overwhelmed several Israeli military bases. This is really big deal, right? And trying to put it into the context, this kind of coordination, the kind of diversity of attack using air, land, sea, using tractors and bulldozers to get through these fortifications, it all being so well timed. Some of the reports today said they've been planning it for 2 years. It's on a particular date that is important for the Jewish people. And what it means militarily, right, is a really big deal in that it was, functionally, Israel's like the fourth most powerful military in the world. And these dudes, like, not wearing shoes and not having modern communication equipment, with against one of the biggest, most sophisticated intelligence apparatuses in the world, caught them off on the back foot.
Yeah.
There was the legitimate military targets that were targeted and was a big problem. I mean, they literally pushed past a lot of the legitimate fortifications, and a lot of soldiers and gun battles erupted out of that. Pushed past that into civilian controlled areas, kibbutzes, and is that the right word? Kibbutz?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in nearby towns, and committed slaughter. Right, there was a nearby music festival that turned into a massacre. One of the things here I want to note is it's really easy to fall into if you are sensitive to the plight of the disproportionate power that Israel has over Palestine, to look at Palestine as a victim and an oppressed group, as the Israelites as oppressors, right? If you have that moral matrix, then what you'll see, what you'll kind of be sensitive to is like this like, I see them this way, so I'm going to identify. If you're used to identify with the oppressed, you can make the error of saying, well, I mean, like, look, they did this thing, right? And it must be because they're oppressed, rather than having them take their own ownership of it. But Hamas has put out a lot of misinformation here. Right? For example, with the Carnival massacre, one of the first videos we saw was of people running away from these guys shooting people. And we now have video of these guys systematically walking and hunting these people down and shooting innocent people as they hid in their cars. Right? And there is no doubt whatsoever that this happened. And yet Hamas still put out, and it's like, no, these are people just caught in a crossfire between the security of the event and Hamas as they were coming through. And they were intending to shoot these unarmed civilians, was what Hamas put out before the videos came out of Hamas literally walking around and executing people as they lay on the ground helpless and unarmed. I mean, come on, guys. It's just absolutely irresponsible to ignore that evidence and just say, well, this is just this is just what happens when you do bad things to people. It's like, no. Hamas owns their actions here, and you can't take that from them, right? And excuse it because of what I'm going to talk about, and I've mentioned and kind of hinted at, that Palestine has lots of problems that are Israelis, Israel needs to take responsibility for. So beware of the internet narratives and the misinformation coming out of there. here's where we're at when it comes to casualty figures. As of yesterday, I tried to look it up before the show. I couldn't find any updated ones, so these might be old numbers. In Gaza, we are currently at 830 people killed, 4,250 injured. In the West Bank, 19 killed, 110 injured. So like that's a different area from Gaza. Keep that in mind. This is over by to the east of Jerusalem. Yeah.
To be clear, those are Palestinians killed. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, those first two figures. So 830 and 19 collectively Palestinians killed.
Yep. And then Israel they're still kind of unwinding a lot of these communities and going through and counting and trying to identify bodies and people. They're currently at 1,200 killed, 2,600 injured, with 22 actually U.S. citizens. Was the calculation that I saw earlier today.
That are confirmed as killed.
Mm-hmm. And then we have a bunch of captives that have also been taken to Gaza. So, or people are just missing. Those aren't part of those figures as far as I can tell. So why did this happen is a very strange story. So why was Israel so unprepared on an intelligence front and then from a military front? There was a lot of speculation this week about whether or not, before this whole thing happened, one of the major stories coming out of Israel was this judicial reform effort from the Benjamin Netanyahu. Did I say his name right?
Close enough.
I never can get his name wrong. All right. That was to reform the judiciary because some people speculate. His case is that the judiciary's kind of like lost their way and they have too much power and they're trying to rebalance the power of the judiciary. If I understand his case right. The case from the skeptics was that the judiciary was getting in the way of building more settlements in the West Bank and expanding settlements at the speed and assertion that the Likud party wanted. And
the Likud party?
That's Bibi's party. I can't say the dude's name. I'm sorry, guys.
Benjamin Netanyahu, henceforth Bibi from David.
Is the Likud party, right? And and it's not an official stance of them, but it's like that right-wing faction wants more settlers to put pressure on the West Bank. Is the accusation from their critics? So there's that question. Is like a bunch of soldiers, and like we're talking thousands of soldiers according to some media reports, were like not ready, in part because there was such a huge constitutional crisis around this judicial reform question. Very interesting analysis because a lot of those soldiers were like, I'm technically on active duty, but I'm going to go home because I'm not going to, because I protest this action by the government to reform the judiciary.
I see. So it was almost as if there was a sort of a strike of sorts, to put it in that terminology.
You can find coverage that suggests that. Now, a bunch of it's a bit gone from the internet now. I was trying to find some of it, but
it was there. And
well, that was the first question I had, right? Is when the strategic question of like, how could this happen first happened on like Sunday. I was like, wait a minute, wasn't there, I just saw a story about all these soldiers that were protesting the actions of the majority government. And then it became very hard to find those stories. So I don't know if that's a true part of that, but I saw other people speculating on that. And it is a worthwhile question of, was the timing as such? And now we do know the timing now was for a very long time. This is not the first time Israel's been attacked on this date. There was another attack in like the 1970s, I think it was on the same date, or the 1980s. And this is a Jewish holiday as well. So like there's all kinds of potential strategic reasons why the Palestinians might attack on this night. Hamas.
But the possibility is that they were attacked. It could have been that Hamas took advantage of this bit of political instability or this, moment when Israeli guards were down to capitalize on this.
And their focus is inward at the time and things like that. Yeah, that could be part of their strategic analysis. It obviously had exactly the opposite effect, right? It created a rally around the flag effect, which is just, of course, in hindsight, but everyone always sees their opponent as different from themselves, but everyone's actually just like everybody else, where if you attack a country, the country's more likely to coalesce around themselves than separate.
It's September 12th, right? Yeah.
And then there's the massive intelligence failure. Like I said earlier, Mossad is an incredibly respected intelligence agency, one of the most strongest in the world from what people report about it. And Egypt, for example, said that they warned them weeks ago. Israel denies this, but it's a very interesting dynamic where, that a lot of people understandably are like, how is it possible that they didn't have any signal intelligence on this?
I mean, that was one of my first questions, was how did Mossad miss this, right? Because of that air of mystique and prowess that they have internationally as being the best,
So the next question is just what happened and the how. It's the aims. Why did this happen? What is Hamas's motivation? So first, the motivation is obviously complaints from Gaza, right? That are just the complaints that happened a long time. It's been turned into an open air prison, that kind of rhetoric. The West Bank is being encroached by Israeli settlers. The theft of Palestinian homes by settlers in the West Bank. The detention of thousands of Palestinians, right? They have a major incarceration problem of Palestinians who are non-Israeli citizens, but are incarcerated in Israeli jails.
And are they being given any sort of due process or anything like that?
That was one of the things that, once again, it's like you can get so much stuff there because you can become an Israeli citizen as an Arab, right? But the dynamic is very peculiar if you're a Palestinian, right? Because you're kind of betraying your people if you become an Israeli citizen too. There's that part of it. There's
the cultural sort of faux pas or
But there's also a difficulty in trying to. There's also put in the American context. Do Native Americans get civil rights? Yeah. We don't treat them like Palestinians, right? In that case, in the sense of that we say that you're self-governing, but you got to be a constitutional republic and you can't invade your neighbors, right? We kind of put bounds around it, but then we specifically say you're citizens. That's not a good analogy for how Palestinians are treated in Israel, right? Where they're a non-citizen that lives within the geographic area of control of Israel or immigrates there too for work. And so in a sense, they're kind of treated like a foreign national, but not with the rights that you would give a foreign national per se, right? So it's a very difficult question because you can't, if you're a Palestinian who in Gaza and you get permit to go to Jerusalem, for example, to go pray for a holy day or something like that, and you make that trip, and then when you're in a market square, you get into a fight with an Israeli police officer, it isn't the same sort of rights that you might have as an Israeli citizen. You're not going to get that same treatment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, where there might be intervention by your embassy or something to intervene on your behalf.
You don't have an embassy,
right? Because there's no real organization there to protect you.
Right. And I want to be clear that I'm not sure that Israel. What Israel should do about that, right? I mean, it seems like a single state solution is way outside of, and we're not talking about a solution yet, but because that's so far out, a two-state solution seems more reasonable, but also not attainable in this moment, especially. That it's hard to imagine how it would work, right? Other than that, I do generally think in every circumstance, a monopoly of power has a responsibility to treat everyone who's domestically within their area with civil liberties because they have a responsibility to use their power for justice, right? So if you, in that circumstance I just painted, which is very friendly to the Palestinians, I get that. And I want to weigh that against the security threat anyone out of Gaza might have, right? They could be a member of Hamas. They could want to go blow up a church or something. If you're in that circumstance as Israel, you have a responsibility to try to give as much civil rights as you can in order to preserve the thing that makes you an actual liberal state while trying to keep your people as secure as possible.
Yeah.
Does that seem reasonable?
Absolutely.
All right. This is the difficulty of this issue, man, is trying to get out of those grooves. It's so hard.
Well, and I want to back up one step because you did mention that there's the theft of Palestinian homes by settlers in the West Bank. There's evidence to suggest that that's actually happening?
Yeah. Let me look this up real quick.
Jacob, this is not your house.
Yes, but if I go, you don't go back. So what's the problem? Why are you yelling at me? I didn't do this.
But
it's easy to yell at me, but I didn't do this.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is gonna steal it.
No one is allowed to steal it, يا عمي.
זה לא שלי להחזיר.
So this isn't proof in the sense like maybe you're asking for.
It's evidence.
It's an example. It's like a watershed moment. It'd be a better way to think about it. Like if you do so, you can find video of Israeli bulldozers bulldozing a community and building a brand new community on top of it. Right? That's very clear. The map work here can be very deceptive. I totally admit that. But on the other side of it, it's pretty clear that there's an expansion of Israeli settlements that is a major wedge issue. And it's complicated in the domestic politics of the West Bank, where if you're a Palestinian, like maybe your property rights aren't as secure as you think as an Israelis. And that's a major problem for Israel's case, that they're the Western democracy liberal order. And just like every country, they're not perfect. I'm sure there's just error in the system, but there's also, step back, look at 75 years of history, a systematic problem for the Palestinian population in the West Bank when it comes to holding onto the property over the long run, and why. Right.
Yeah. And I mean, just to further qualify it, I mean, this one anecdote can't substantiate a broader trend, but it is a data point within that, right?
Yeah, and it's not really, that's what I mean, it's like a watershed, right? It kind of shows the dialogue in a compelling way, but like this is something that's happening systemically, right? It's kind of happening behind the scenes and overtly, but also subvertly. And I there's not really a debate that it's not happening, right? I mean, like I feel like if there was a clear, there is no settlement problem in the West Bank, that evidence is really on Israel to provide, because I have seen zero of that kind of pushback. And I've been looking, I've really been trying, because it would be much easier for me to see this as, purely in my own biases of a, Western property rights driven democracy against an Islamic caliphate, right? I'm obviously on that side of Western, right? To the degree they are, but there's a lot of, there could be some misinformation out there, but I'm fairly confident, everything I looked at, that the encroachment of settlements is a substantial, contentious issue in Israel today that, is one of the complaints that Hamas has. Even if it weren't a contentious issue, like this is a motivation, right?
For sure.
And then there's violence at Al-Qudsa, which is the Temple Mount, right? And
Al-Aqsa?
Al-Aqsa, there you go. The Temple Mount. That's that the Israeli defense minister is part of a radical pro-war religious party and has been leading street battles with Muslims to push them out of the temple. Now, this goes into a whole bunch of history, right? We don't have to dive into right now, but just really quick and dirty. There's a particular mountain in Jerusalem. It at one point was the site, according to Jews, of the first and second temple of the Bible. If you read the Old Testament, that's why it's important for the Jews and it's important for Christians. And according to the prophecy of the Torah, it's supposed to be the site of the third temple eventually. And then the Messiah comes and stuff like that. If I understand it right, someone correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not Jewish, so I'm doing my best to understand their point of view. The Muslim takeover of this area of at the time after the Romans was basically Muslimified the entire area. Everyone converted to Islam and built a temple on top of where the old temple, the second temple, resided before the Romans destroyed it. So Romans destroyed it. Soon afterwards, a new mosque was built on top of it much later. So this is this particular kind of focal point of the three religions of the area and the disagreement about, this particular thing. Now, there's an error we make in the West, especially as like secularists in the West, to see this strictly as a religious problem. And it's not, right? There's ethnic problems. There's ethnic strife going on. There's racial strife going on. And I don't think that's unsubstantial. Like when you see them, the way they dialogue about Israelis versus Arabs, and this is as a white dude on the outside just looking at it, like there's a tremendous amount of ethnic, racist, religious, nationalistic, and then socioeconomic dynamics that are all stacked on top of each other here. And that's what makes it so contentious. And so you don't want to boil it down to that, but it is really important for Hamas to justify this on religious terms. And part of that is like a pretty decent case, in which case you have Israel, the stronger party in the area, with a defense minister and a new coalition government that is between the Likud party and parties, which is kind of like, think of it like a moderate Republican party, and the parties to the right of Likud that are even more radical about such things. And the Israeli defense minister is a dude who is, by reputation, associated with we need to level the mosque there and build a third temple so that we can fulfill the prophecy of the Torah sort of guy.
So pretty extreme guy.
And so and is accused, and I don't know how substantiated this is, but is accused at least, and that's all they need at Hamas is just the accusation of impropriety of him leading what's the right word? A gang, a private group of Israeli to do street battle by the mosque and throw out the Muslims. So that kind of violence out there is documented and it's there and you can find it. The third motivation is bringing Israel to the table to negotiate their conditions and mutual prisoner release. Now, Israel's done this many times. So you got all these Palestinians that are in jail, and according to the Palestinians, not given the right kind of due process. And I think it's really up to Israel to prove that they are treating these people right. And I'm sure that I would much rather be in an Israeli jail than a Palestinian jail or a Hamas jail. But still, you have this issue, right, where they're saying, hey, this is an issue. We want the release of our people because we're at war with you, right? There's this Hamas war with Israel going on. And so they're, one of their aims is try to get Israel to release their prisoners in exchange for theirs. So they're trying to get leverage. And then third and fourth, and this is the most important part for how we need to think about it as Americans, is the theory of terrorism, right? This isn't what they say. This is what I say about their underlying motivation, which is that their goal is to provoke Israel and the United States into a response. This is similar to, what's his name? He wrote Rules for Radicals. Spacing right now.
Saul Alinsky.
Saul Alinsky's, the action is in the reaction, meaning you do something to provoke. When you're the weaker party and you're going against a stronger party, you do something to provoke them into action. And that reaction is the thing that you use to destroy them, right? A great example is 9/11, right? This helps, I think, Americans see it from their point of view. When we think of 9/11 now, it's easy just to think of it as we were attacked and so we went and invaded Afghanistan. We don't tell the story from where it starts, which is the originator of the attack, Osama bin Laden, had a goal, and that goal was known. That goal was to attack us so that we would invade Afghanistan, get bogged down into a war of empire that destroys us.
For people who are hearing that for the first time, first, can you repeat it? Secondly, is there somewhere you can find it to substantiate it?
Oh yeah. This is, if you read, I'm forgetting the biographer's name, but Osama bin Laden's biography, right? And there's been multiple written. It's a standard explanation. It is the theory of how they won against the USSR too, right? I mean, we funded the Mujahideen and trained Osama bin Laden as an asset of the CIA in the 1980s because the USSR invaded Afghanistan for all kinds of reasons, partly for kind of commercial purposes. To
resources.
Yeah. And then we trained these fighters who, guerrilla fighters to attack them. Kind of like a tit for tat for Vietnam for them funding the Viet Cong. And the goal was to get them to spend a bunch of money go into debt for their military expenditure to hold on to this land so that it bankrupt them. Osama bin Laden's stated theory of victory for attacking us on 9/11 was to provoke us into an overreaction that then killed lots of Muslim lives and got more Muslims to join the fight against the West, eventually leading to either Muslim victories via direct confrontation, or to basically get us to spend ourselves into oblivion, get us to the place where we have massive inflation, social unrest domestically, and we start tearing ourselves apart like an empire tends to do when they get overextended and deficit ridden.
Well, I would say, regardless of whether or not he was entirely responsible for that is certainly where we have found ourselves.
Right. We're responsible for our overreaction. That's the point. We have to learn the lesson of history, which is when you're the more powerful actor, what are your insecurities? It is the unity of your country, right? So yeah, we were super unified on 9/12, But 2 years later, we had people saying, hey, if you don't support our invasion of Iraq, you're not a real American. And them saying, wait, I'm a real American. How dare you say I'm not a real American? I just don't want to go kill 1 million people for no reason.
Well, speaking of responsibility to that, though, there were other forces that would stand to benefit from that invasion, correct?
Right.
And we were lied to, or perhaps it was, to give the most generous viewpoint, there was misleading intelligence, perhaps at least, a lie at best, that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, right? That was the narrative to get us into Iraq. But there were none that were ever found. Right. So there were forces who were actively seeking to utilize that moment, right? That crisis and reaction to shepherd us into a conflict.
Right. And that's the calculation of like the murderous insanity of Hamas, right? Is to do something so awful and horrible that Israel will overreact, do something awful and horrible in return, and the entire Muslim world sees that. And then as of yesterday, the former leader of Hamas made a big call to all of Islam to go attack a Westerner anywhere this Friday, tomorrow, when we're recording this, right? Maybe after this comes out or before this comes out. And God protect people. I just can't even imagine what might happen, right? And I think that is one thing now where, bad things are happening in Palestine, right? Bombings and children are suffering and all kinds of bad things. But how much worse it could get, especially if Israel does a land invasion of Gaza with tanks and people can't leave and all the difficulties that are happening in Gaza. If that gets really bad, how this could snowball into a regional conflict where lots of people will suffer, where this could snowball into a worldwide jihad, like people are dying in all over the world from Muslims who see bad things happening to Palestinians and then acting. Now, keep that in mind. Some of that's on Hamas, right? They are intentionally using their people to inspire people to attack Westerners, right? Some of that is on, obviously on Israel to make sure that the response is as such that deprives them of the thing that they need in order to perpetuate this conflict, right? How do they do that, right? That could be an intractable problem, but geez, if you're looking at it clearly, I don't see how you can know your opponent's strategy to defeat you and then feed it, right? Because that's what we did in Afghanistan. That was our error, right? We could have done a letters from mark of reprisal. We could have done this very differently. We didn't have to do a land invasion and occupy it for 20 years. We could have done this very, very differently, but we didn't. And now we're paying the consequence of it. Where, okay. How many billions of dollars of equipment was left in Afghanistan?
Too many.
Right? What if some of those weapons were used by Hamas in this attack, right? How did they get M4s? We don't know. Well, there's a lot of unknowns here, and I'm just speculating. So keep this with a grain of salt. But, we have this situation where the unintended consequences of massive military actions are so wide ranging that we have to be very careful. And and you're asking Israel at the point where they're most emotionally triggered to be very, very careful. And that's like, that's the praiseworthy thing out of the State Department has been like, hey, do what you got to do to protect yourself. Absolutely. We understand that. We don't want anyone innocent to die, but try to minimize civilian casualties because this is what they're going to use against you. The Israeli response has been shutting off water, food, and electricity to prosecute the, quote, human animals, end quote, in Gaza. So it looks like Israel's fallen in the trap because, like, it's one thing to say, hey, we try to warn everybody in this building before we bomb the building that we're going to bomb the building in order to deprive the opponents from having a base of operations. Okay, it's another thing to basically turn off all the power and so they can't and keep all the food from getting there when you're saying we're going to differentiate between the women and the children and the bad guys. This is a particular doctrine in Israel. Once again, an indetractable problem, but it is a doctrine. It's called the Dahiyya doctrine. We'll put a link to the Wikipedia on it. And basically what it means is when they hit your civilian population, the only rational response from Israel is to hit their civilian population to a greater degree thus emphasizing, like creating the incentive not to. I don't know what Israel should do better, but this feels to me as a Westerner, as a person who grew up around Native American reservations, and the anthology of Western guilt around how we treated the Native Americans, like a justification to do very terrible things and blame it on the person you're doing it to. Because saying, there's a big difference between saying we have a doctrine that says our goal is to hit as many, I do that because it's just like, it's so terrible, is to hit as many civilians as possible because they are hitting civilians and we can't help it because they are bad guys, really removes your responsibility, right? And then it perpetuates the cycle of violence.
It attempts to.
Right.
It attempts to remove the responsibility, but it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I don't want to make the case, I don't want to overstate it too. This is a doctrine. It's not the doctrine. Sure. If I said that earlier, I'm sorry. What I mean is it is a doctrine of Israel to do that. Some people within the Israeli government adhere to, and some people probably criticize. But be very careful about that in what you're thinking of in the Israeli response. We got to make sure it doesn't turn into the full doctrine. There is this strange thing happening with Israel telling people to leave and then warning people of attacks and bombings and stuff like that, and then people not being able to go anywhere. Like, for example, it was reported that they were encouraged to go to Egypt. If you notice on the map, there is of course the southwestern part of Israel is Egypt. The problem is that Egypt doesn't want Palestinians. It's a heck of a problem. I would hope that what Egypt would do would be take women and children and get them out of this space.
Can you explain why Egypt doesn't want Palestinians? Like why they wouldn't, seek at least provide asylum temporarily?
I'll try. Well, temporary is a heck of a problem, right?
Well, how temporary is it? I mean, this is a big question.
Yeah, right. Like, and how to spend it. I mean, Egypt's not a first world country. It's a poorer country than many, not all. You don't want to treat Palestinians the same as Egyptians. They're a different ethnic group. These are not fungible groups. Just because they share a common religion doesn't mean they treat each other the same. It's like Americans, and I struggle with this too. I'm not speaking down to Americans on this. We sometimes struggle with the difference between ethnicity, religion, race. These things all feel very strange to us, at least to me, from my background. So Palestinians aren't treated in Egypt as first-class citizens. So there's a lack of incentive for them to think, everything's going to be better if I go to Egypt. Well, it's going to be complicated. Will you be in what you describe as an open-air prison? I don't think so, but it's not necessarily a guaranteed better life. Mm-hmm. And there's also additionally legitimate criticisms of Palestinians to say like, hey, what's more important? Like the crusade to make sure that, there's Palestine isn't defeated by Israel. So you got to stay in order to keep the, as you described, colonial power, perpetually in its, place of dominance and destruction, or is the goal, or should be the goal be the preservation of your children and your children's life?
So is it similar to sort of like a caste system in India? Is that,
you mean Egypt?
Just the perception of Palestinians as sort of second class, or is there a ranking system like amongst Arab nations in that way? Yeah, sorry.
I don't think it's formal. What I suspect is it's more like a cultural bias would be the way to think about it. Yeah. You have a fundamental, cultural bias that's like Palestinians aren't the same as Egyptians. Duh. Yeah. Right. And Egypt's for the Egyptians, right? Like that's how it's understood there. And, while there might be sympathy, cross-Muslim sympathy and things like that, there's a historical problem here too. After the, kind of initial war, that founded the state of Israel, 700,000 Palestinians. And what I mean by Palestinians here too is like, it's a very complicated story. So I'm going to try to do it justice. From the time of 1880 to 1942, there was a tremendous amount of immigration for jobs around the area to Israel of Arabs and Muslims. Palestinians means them and the people who are there when the Zionist Israelites, I mean that technically, came there to have a land for the Jews, right?
And just for the sake of folks who don't know what the term Zionist is, those are people that desire to see an ethno-state for Jews, that being Israel. Is that correct?
That would be the technical way to say it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's approximately right. Like you're just saying that there should be a country where Jews should feel safe, right? And
Sure.
that's completely rational. After the Holocaust,
100%.
you can't imagine people saying, like where would be safe? I mean, America betrayed our Jews here. The Holodomor is about to happen, right? Where Jews in Ukraine and all across the USSR are going to be put into a very difficult circumstance. And
You mean like right now?
No. I mean,
at that period in time.
At that period of time,
Okay.
right? And we're talking about landowning Jews, for example, in Ukraine or something like that. And there could be, there's all kinds of pressure across Europe, pogroms that have been going on for decades prior to that period.
What is a pogrom?
Basically, I want a bunch of either state action or private action to just purge a unpopular people group, right? So you can, there are like Catholic purges in England, right? And there's also Jewish purges. Pogrom was just kind of like a catch-all word for when that happened in Europe.
Sure.
Man, there's a lot to get up on here. So
We go down a lot of rabbit holes
Yeah.
trying to
Trying to
explain
give you guys
things
the
thoroughly.
context.
Yeah.
So with the founding of the independence of Israel and the after World War II, the UN said, hey, we're going to do this thing, this like agreement. And it's difficult to understand that the UN can't create a country too. Like that's actually a very complicated story there too. We won't touch on it right now, but the UN pretty much says, here's a deal. Jerusalem is going to be a kind of international city, kind of controlled by no one and everyone. We'll have a particular area that'll be for Jews who want to leave Europe and go here. And then we'll have this area for the Palestinians, the people who are currently there. And it doesn't look like this map now. It looks like a map very much inverted to that, where most of the area was controlled by Palestine. After the, Jews get established, of course, a lot of the Muslim countries around there take offense to that and attack. Two things happen at once. One, the independence wars, what people from Israel call it. And there's also a purging that happens. So this is I wouldn't say controversial. It seems like the historical rhetoric is bifurcated, right? There's there's an Israel story and there's a Palestinian story, and anyone coming at this is going to have a hard time telling which is which. Like it's very clear which is which when you're listening to it, and it's hard to know what's true. But as far as I can tell, taking the best sources I could find is that there's two things that happen at once. One, Israel drastically expands its territory. It beats back all the surrounding Arab countries. 700,000 to 800,000 to 600,000, somewhere in that ballpark range of 200,000. Palestinians leave, or pretty much pick up and move because of all the fighting that's going on.
Out of present day Palestine.
Yeah, assuming they would be able to come back, right? This happens in war, right? They go to Egypt, they go to Jordan, they go to Syria, they go to all the surrounding areas. And for a lot of those areas, some of them take them in, and then they have a refugee problem, and some of them actually keep them out. And there's like these refugee camps, some of them in Lebanon and Syria that have been around forever. Like they still have refugee camps of former Palestinians in those areas. Terrible humanitarian problem. You have 3 generations of people growing up in a camp. Horrifying, bad poverty issue. At the same time, and I have to mention this because I wouldn't be doing my honesty, the historical record does suggest that there were both private and public actors who were Israeli who wiped out entire villages of Palestinians. That is a fact. And part of this is the land grab of that, and the resentment of that is still in play, right? So if you look at the March to Return, right, which was pretty much a protest movement in 2019 that said, we're going to do a peaceful protest in Gaza. And it was kind of like, it wasn't organized by Hamas. It was actually organized by a guy who's a journalist and a poet who then says, hey, I had this idea, we should do this, and we're going to do a peaceful protest. And there's a really great Joe Rogan Experience interview with the Abby Martin, I think her name is, and she did a whole documentary on it, and you've got to watch it. Because one of the things that happen in a lot of the rhetoric of this space is people say, well, they only respond to violence. They never do anything else. They never do the Gandhi thing. And this is them trying to do the Gandhi thing. And unfortunately, I looked, man, I could not find any prosecution of soldiers who did this, but there were several, hundreds of protesters shot at these and died. And we're talking women, children, medics, press.
Unarmed.
Unarmed.
No
Throwing
confusion
stones
around.
at tanks.
Okay,
Right?
so not like, and to be clear about that particular anecdote, you're referring to the 13-year-old boy who had the sling with the rock and threw a rock at a tank and was shot, right? But generally speaking, unarmed, peacefully protesting people.
Right.
There's no intermingling with people with guns, or there's no presence of that.
You know,
as far as you could tell.
you watch the documentary, you make the best conclusion you can. I mean, the very specific case was Hamas was like approving, but did not organize. The call was specifically for there not to be an armed protest, rather to try to raise international sympathy in a very Gandhi-like, MLK-like attempt to help people understand and see what's going on in Gaza at the time. And the West largely ignored it
with violence.
and then ignored when it happened.
Oh, after the fact.
Yeah. I mean, like, you didn't hear about it till now. I mean, how many people listening to this knew about the March to Return? Now, the March to Return is specifically why I bring it up right now, is it was about a march to, hey, a lot of us aren't actually from Gaza, and we would like to go back to our homes. And we would, but some of their homes are in the West Bank or in their areas controlled by Israel, and Israel doesn't want those people. Or they are in Jordan, and Jordan doesn't want those people. So what do you do with them? Like, this is meant to be the start of a negotiation to do something about this, and not just make it a domestic problem for Israel to handle on its own. This was meant to appeal to the larger international community because they don't feel like they can get a fair share from Israel. Israel specifically said this was like a manipulation by Hamas to try to create sympathy.
Oh, so that the March to Return was that.
Yeah. And the problem is I'm having a hard time believing Israel at this moment, right? Because everything I saw was that. So if you have another case, you got to make a better case. Because afterwards, I looked and I could not find how this could be anything other than what it looked like when you're watching it. And you watch the 2-hour documentary, you could look at the news coverage around it, and you could do your own research. It seems like to me, if you were Israel and what you really wanted was a peaceful solution, you would have taken this opportunity to not to prosecute soldiers who shot people, and to specifically hold your own side accountable, and to specifically use this as an opportunity to start peace negotiations and stuff like that. I do want to know too, the American government response and a few things with that. Because our internal dialogue really matters in this space, because we're the world power, right? We're the hegemon. And Israel's looking to us, and American soldiers are both like part of the captives in Gaza and have been killed by Hamas. So one response is that the American government is sending one or two, I saw conflicting reports, aircraft carriers. I don't understand why. I think they might be thinking, oh, this might turn into a regional conflict, right? And that's why we need air support there.
Well, yeah, and I think there's another assertion around this that may be playing into that, and that is that Iran was complicit in funding or approving or planning or something to do with Hamas's attack on Israel. Is there evidence to suggest that is true?
There's our news report. I don't want to say there's evidence, right? That's the crazy thing is it was so quick. I mean, within a day of this attack, there's a Wall Street Journal article saying Iran met with Hamas right beforehand, and this is a whole thing.
And so that meeting was substantiated to be clearly this is their involvement in this event,
right? And there was
whether
also,
or not that's true.
Yeah, right. I mean, like, we don't know what happened at the meeting. I mean, and Hamas and Iran have a relationship, right? Because of the how important the Palestinian plight is to their movement as the Iranian Revolution, right? As it's hard to you have to try to see things from a completely different worldview, right? Which is the worldview of a colonized people, right? Who had the lines of their country drawn by the Sykes-Picot Agreement way back in the day, who were dominated by, and I'm talking about Iran in this case.
Right. And just to be clear, yeah, we're not talking about Israel having colonized. We're talking about like British and other old world superpowers colonizing the entire Middle East and drawing political lines around groups of people that are ethnically very different from one another and have conflicts of their own. Right.
Well, and specifically drawing the lines to make the Middle East weak, right? The reason why you draw Iraq the shape that it is in order to prevent them from having a water port. That's why you put Kuwait there, right? Sykes-Picot was designed, and this is the standard historical record. I'm not saying anything controversial here. Was designed, and it's not, Sykes-Picot was a diplomatic cable that got released. It's not the actual thing, but it's about the negotiation between the French and the British to specifically draw these lines around ethnic lines that would keep any one power from gaining control and dominion over the Middle East, so they would never have another Ottoman Empire to contend with. That's the point, right? So, and then additionally to that, so if you're Iran and your whole battle is with BP and British Petroleum, and you have the whole story with the Iranian Revolution, which we don't need to get into, one of your kind of like trigger points to get Muslims into the fight with you, and this is the same trigger point that Saudi Arabia uses with Wahhabism, that the Salafists use, that the Taliban use, like everybody in the Middle East uses this, is the plight of the Palestinians, because it is, from their narrative, a very clear example of, and I leave this to the listener to decide, because it's difficult to talk about this in a different way than how we kind of frame it, right? But there's an attempt to, what their story is that there is the Muslims in this area that have been there for a very long time have this Western colonial European state put on top of them that is Israel, right? And then you use their plight to gin up your people, right? So that's Iran's incentive to work with Hamas, even though Iran is Shia and Hamas is Sunni, right? They don't agree on theology. In fact, Hezbollah, which is more associated with Lebanon, but is more like northern Israel, as a problem in northern Israel, is much closer related to Iran. They're more of a Lebanese Shia group. And on top of that, like they were founded, according to reports that I read, founded by Iranian Revolutionary Guard members. So they're not like, it isn't just by having a meeting doesn't suggest that Iran planned this in any substantial way, right? It would be like saying the Ukraine, like a particular offensive of Ukraine was planned by America because Zelensky met with Biden. Mm-hmm. It may be, but
all of the different Muslim factions that exist that all have this sort of common enemy in Israel can and will potentially coordinate or potentially just use certain events and actions to their own benefit,
right?
Because they all have sort of this common enemy in that state,
right? That's that. You got if you're taking it from the Muslim worldview, what you're doing is you're trying to say we are the victim of this colonial oppression, and we need to bind together and fight them, and like that's like in contrast to what was at before the collapse of Iraq. The dominant question was: are we Muslims first or are we Arabs first? Right? It's a religion versus ethnic question. Right? Are we nationalists first? Are we about like taking the lines that we've been given to by the Western powers and making the best of it and trying to make, countries out of them? Or should we reject that and create a new state? That's what ISIS was. ISIS was an attempt to do that out of the space between Syria and Iraq. So like, if you're trying to adopt their point of view so you can understand it, you got to start with that kind of matrix of moral thinking where you're the victim of a colonial oppression from the outside that has kind of created all the conditions that you object to. And Palestinians are like the best case example of that, as they are actively like in this space where they have little giant walls around them and they have to have permission to go get a job outside of their workplace and all that kind of stuff. All right. So the other one, and I do want to praise the State Department on this, is the U.S. has said it's discussing with Israel and Egypt options for securing safe passage for civilians leaving Gaza who may be caught in the crossfire as Israel retaliates from Hamas's deadly onslaught and prepares for a likely ground offensive as tanks and reservists are being called to the front lines. So a couple breakdowns of the right-wing message on this. in America. Everybody on the right wing did a great job calling out the evil of Hamas. Many called for punishment of Hamas, which is totally understandable. The best called out for punishment that spared innocent lives and called for cool heads, in my opinion, right? The worst called for indiscriminate slaughter, usually along the lines of the collectivist era that we're talking about, where it's, do what you got to do, turn it into a parking lot sort of rhetoric that's completely disgusting. And basically, at its core is an argument, slaughter innocent civilians because they slaughtered innocent civilians, which is a terrible argument.
Yeah. So why is it that the political right in the United States tends to side with Israel?
Well, I think, so I want to introduce a concept that I think will help people understand all this stuff and why the allyship happens on the right. And I call it the moral matrix. There's been a more thorough write-up by a Cato scholar. I forget his name right now. I should have linked it, but I can get you the link. And basically, the argument is that different people, based upon their personality and their kind of intuitive, biological-driven, like moral values, and I mean like how strong your disgust mechanism is and stuff like that, have chosen a particular like moral philosophy, and it's usually in some kind of tension between two different, like a bad thing and a good thing. In this case, it would be like civilization versus barbarism, right? That's very classically associated with conservatives. If you read God and Man at Yale, what was it? National Review editor. Forget and spacing this. My head is just full of foreign policy at the moment. I can't remember books I've read. God and Man at Yale, is that right?
God and Man at Yale.
Yeah.
William F. Buckley Jr.
Yes, Buckley. All right. A lot of that is kind of talking about, and a lot of conservatism is based upon this idea, like we have a noble tradition, a noble civilization, and what we need to do is make sure it doesn't degenerate. We got to make sure it does from within or get conquered by barbarians without, right? And you don't have to be conservatives to embrace that. It's just that the core moral, like crux, the moral matrix of it is based there. So they kind of frame it as Israel's, like civilization, and and Islam and caliphates and stuff like that are barbarous, right? They force marry, they do female genital mutilation, they cut off the heads of their enemies, right? There's all kinds of ways to push back against that and criticisms against the West. Not saying that those aren't real, but that's the idea that we have something noble we're shooting for that is civilized, and there's a group of people who don't share those values, and we've got to be careful we don't either turn into those people and allow ourselves to kind of, metamorphosize into them. And that's kind of like the push against progressivism and like, social justice warrior and stuff like that. And then there's like people from the outside, which even triggers the more conservative mindset more, because conservatives are very much by temperament organized by borders and like arrangement of the sacred versus the unholy. So borders, conservatives by nature tend to emphasize borders more, while liberals tend to de-emphasize borders because they're more open and they're not as morally sensitive to holiness or civilization versus barbarism. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
They tend to see these as subjective categories as a liberal, while as a conservative, you're like, no, this is a very objective category. Some of us have forced marriages and some of us don't. Right? Some of us throw homosexuals off of buildings and some of us don't.
It's interesting to me though, because there's an opposition philosophically that I'm seeing here. There's like a misalignment between the American left, as you described, de-emphasizing borders, more open, and the very strict philosophies and sort of, in their own way, religiously very conservative mentalities and values of Islamic people.
Yeah. Also,
but it's odd that like the American right tends to align itself with Israel and the American left tends to align itself with Muslim, perspectives, but they're so at odds with each other.
And it makes sense when you realize that the left wing moral matrix is oppressor oppressed. Right? It isn't. It's rather than civilization versus barbarism, it's who is the oppressor, right? And those are the bad guys, and the oppressed are the good guys. So in the Palestinian worldview, why you have so many people who are like purple-haired, lesbian, feminist types, which is totally fine to be.
Great. Love it.
But if you're that person, and why you see so many of those people like being, hey, pro-Palestine, right, and anti-Israel, is because of the sensitivity of colonization has on their mental model of the world, right? So if you see the world as like a patriarchy that's oppressing people, that are oppressing women or oppressing gays or the LGBTQ plus community, you're also seeing it as like the West oppressing the Middle East, right? Which is a perfectly fine way to think about it in some frameworks, right? In the sense of sometimes you have imperial regimes that do bad things to their citizens, and they're not like, think of the Dutch during the colonial era, terrible regime, right? Think of the British putting down Gandhi, right? The good guy is Gandhi. The bad guy are the British, right? It's very clear that colonialism has huge problems, right? So it's a perfectly fine mental model, just like civilization versus barbarism. It's just that it creates that kind of bedfellowness, because what they're saying is like, we're fellow travelers in oppression, but that's not necessarily how the people in, they're not seeing it from identity politics point of view. If you're in Gaza, right? They don't agree with their lifestyle, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure they also appreciate having anybody in the West who, sees their plight and is willing to sympathize with them, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, and that's partially because like the conservatives also have this. I mean, beyond their moral matrix problem, and I think that's the larger, more secular conservative point of view on this. The religious point of view the formal religious point of view can't be underestimated too, right? We have about 100 years of American Christian doctrine since the founding of the state of Israel that kind of puts them on a different place, right? Where the theology of Americans have kind of shifted, where prior to the founding of Israel is kind of a non-factor, right? Like it's part of your religious education, but it isn't seen as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, where a lot of Christians today see it that way, right? Not everybody does. And there's a lot of debate on the theology here. We should have Adam on sometime and we could talk about it. But because I think as an Orthodox, it's even more interesting point of view, because with they're pre that stuff, right? They're not on that same kind of vanguard that the evangelicals can be when it comes to this question of the state of Israel. That gets very combined with the politics here, where it's like Israel's the chosen people of God, and therefore we should support them because they're the good guys, kind of regardless of what happens. I'm not going to criticize that right now, although I think there are probably good criticisms. But that definitely plays a major role in the right-wing support of Israel. Next one that is, so the left also had wins and losses here, right? And they had, good leftists, including like President Biden, called out the evil. The best ones called out for peace. The best ones called out for starting peace talks, which is a good thing, right? Although were largely called out as appeasement for doing so. And then the worst justified the murder of innocent civilians in the name of decolonization, right? And those are truly terrible. Like the BLM thing that happened, although there's some question about whether or not that was real BLM or like a individual who just associated with.
What is that? What happened?
Oh, Black Lives Matter basically put out like a meme poster. Okay, so one of the things that happened with this is there was a dude, or a couple guys, who got like those parachuting, I don't know what you call it. We got like the big fan and like a parachute, and you fly.
Oh yeah.
What's it called?
Yeah, it's like a motorized paraglider or something like that.
Yeah. And like they got weapons and they're flying in, and they use that to fly over the barriers, right? And so there's like there's an iconography they were trying to create with that of like flying over the barriers of your oppression sort of thing. And it really came off as looking like, and by rhetoric, I'm not saying this is an unfair categorization, but they basically were saying the good guys here are Palestine, and that was wrong.
So to be clear, because that was a tactic that Hamas used to invade Israel, right? They did fly over the border with these motorized paragliders. You're saying that BLM activists did that as well, sort of like they didn't attack anyone, of course, but they did that as sort of some sort of symbolic thing. Is that what you're saying?
No, let me show you.
I'm misunderstanding the moment here. What BLM did specifically?
Yeah. This was the image.
Oh, okay. So this was an image put out by someone.
Black Lives Matter. No, this isn't the original. This is a copy of it.
But someone seemingly affiliated with Black Lives Matter put out this image of the
right. And they also put out statements that were pretty much blaming Israel for the slaughter of these innocents.
I see. Yeah. To read for those only listening here, this image reads: Black Lives Matter grassroots stands in solidarity with our Palestinian family who are currently resisting 57 years of settler colonialism and apartheid. As Black people continue the fight to end militarism and mass incarceration in our own communities, Let us understand the resistance in Palestine as an attempt to tear down the gates of the world's largest open-air prison. As a radical black organization grounded in abolitionist ideals, we see clear parallels between black and Palestinian people.
And that's oppressor oppressed, right? That kind of demonstrates the moral matrix that I'm talking about. So, obviously a lot of people found that very offensive, right? Because, there's that, right? And then you have things like Harvard and Yale, their student groups, pro-Palestine student groups put out stuff that basically said, hey, if you don't like this, you should end the practices of Israel against Palestine. And that it's just like the wrong place, wrong time sort of thing. Yeah. Some of it's like people who are legitimately like, they spent a long time thinking about this issue. And, right now we're trying to mourn the loss of children's lives and the terror that was caused by these terrible actors. Isn't the time to say, hey, but they have real grievances. Right? No, that's the time to say those people are terrible, period. And then a few days later, or even in another paragraph, if you want to be really aggressive about it, you say there are civilians in Palestine suffering daily and they have real problems. And these people are not, this isn't a good strategy. These aren't good people that they're representing or that kind of thing. And we need to, if you value the human lives of the people of Palestine, I totally understand where you're coming from, right? Because I've been consuming that stuff too. I've been trying to understand that point of view, right? Because that's the only way you get to truth, right? You don't get to truth by dogmatically following a party line, right? You got to consume the other things around you, right? And so if you're saying like, look, I saw the March for Peace. I saw peaceful Palestinians be shot in the face, children, women, press, medics, and it was terrible what they did in 2019, right? And it's a shame that the West didn't pay attention then, because we never would have got to hear if we would have got to peace talks after that. That's a much better point than saying, hey, it's okay, like Hamas is justified. This is actually Israel's fault.
Yeah.
Because these same people would also be very upset if when Israel says it's okay for us to have collateral damage, right? Understandably, collateral damage is terrible, right? So when these collateral damage is, children and women and medics and all those kind of things, it's that collective punishment is bad when both sides do it. And I hate it because like you say both sides and what you hear is that like Reddit voice in your head saying, oh, both sides, oh, you're just lazy. No, I'm really trying to engage here. And what I see is an error made by both sides.
There have been a lot of mistakes made and a lot of terrible decisions made. And I mean, well, it's a very interesting time because the emotions are so high that people, I mean, we know that when your reptile brain turns on, right? The cortex that's responsible for emotion, was that your amygdala, right? Your fight or flight, like kind of your really base reactions. Your reasoning in your frontal cortex turns off, right? Your ability to actually digest and understand things impartially is impaired. And so it's almost impossible at this point for people who are consuming like such traumatic media. And I mean, like, there's no mistake. Like, it is traumatic to see and read and hear about some of the things that have happened right now. And even in past conflicts, it's super traumatic. And it makes sense that people are struggling to think about these things in any way rationally. Because, whether or not you have like an affiliation, it's still like inhumane. Everything that's happening.
And that's why I keep on using the word indetractable, right? Because anytime I'm advancing on a side of that, I'm saying, but I understand Israel has a security problem here. On the other side of it, Palestinians have a real problem. If you can't get access to food and water, what are you willing to do to change the status quo?
Right.
That's a tough problem. And then on top of that, them not being, spring virgin grass and just completely innocent. The only innocent people here are the children being indoctrinated into radical Islam inside Gaza, or being told on the other side that all the Palestinians want to do is kill you.
Yeah.
Right. That's neither of those two things are good ways to treat children, much less, the inevitable suffering that happens when Hamas does this. I think we gotta turn off the emotions, right? And we gotta start trying. If one of the goals is like to get out of the grooves and try to forge a different lexicon, or maybe not lexicon, because I'm not an expert in the space, so I couldn't do that. But maybe some mental models that would help people navigate these stories as they come up and navigate these arguments better. That was hopefully like what I wanted to try to contribute, right? What I've done so far is try to describe things accurately. Mm-hmm. What I hope from here is to try to be more, less is, but more ought. Like, this is how people ought to think about these things.
Yeah.
Because what I suspect is, by being congruent with our philosophy that has made Western civilization so successful, reason, not superstition, right? Operating by maxims and principles rather than free-floating alliance thinking. There's a great book called Weird. Have you ever heard of it before?
I have heard of it, yes.
Yeah. It's like why Western people are so unique is pretty much what the study is. And
Weird being an acronym, right?
Yeah.
Western, educated, industrialized, something.
Yeah, something like that. We'll put it in the notes.
Yes.
That book really demonstrates just how different we think, right? And what we want to do is, just like you said, we want to resist like the kind of falling down to a moral order that is actually more normal to humans, which is my side good, other bad, right? And instead engage with, how do we think about this in a way that hopefully, and this isn't saying that we can, using our podcast, change the way Israel or Hamas or anyone thinks about it, but rather how individuals can think systematically in a way that applies here that would help us understand and not be fooled by the misinformation that's happening or the manipulations that happen from people in this space.
So this is the end of part 1 of our 2-part series, trying to understand the complex nature of the conflict in Israel. Check out the next episode for part 2, where we dive into the mental models that surround this issue to try to give you some frameworks and ways to interpret things, lenses through which to view them, to better understand what's going on. Thanks for tuning in to Human Reaction. Help us fight internet censorship by liking, commenting, subscribing, following, and sharing the show with your friends. To find us around the internet, visit linktree.com/humanreactionpod.